Hello, Mishpacha, it's Courtney, America's Jewish mother. I am back for another Friday Reads video. So I actually finished 4 books this week. And I am currently reading 4, so I would like to share those with you. So I'm participating in Doris at Aldi Books' Summer School Readathon, so I will link that announcement video down below if you are unfamiliar with that. So that has various prompts that go along with it. I've already completed language arts, science. I picked 2 books for most of the prompts. I finished one this week that had to do with math, one this week that had to do with social science, and then I also completed my Common Core prompt, which was to pair a related fiction and nonfiction, so I would like to share that one with you first. So the 2 books I paired together were William Maxwell's They Came Like Swallows, which was published in 1937. This is fiction. This is set, this basically revolves around a family that is touched by the influenza epidemic of 1918 and how that affects them. So it's pretty short. It's fewer than 180 pages, and it's split into 3 parts or sections, and each of those sections follows a character in the family. So the first section follows 8-year-old Peter Morrison, who's referred to as Bunny. The second section follows his 13-year-old brother, Robert. And the last section follows their father, who I think his name is James. I'm pretty sure that's his name. Anyway, so yeah, so it's basically, like I said, about how the influenza epidemic touches this particular family. And then I paired that book with Frank Kermode's The Sense of an Ending, Studies in the Theory of Fiction. So this is literary theory and criticism. This was originally, this book was originally given as a series of lectures at Bryn Mawr by Frank Kermode in, I think, 1965, and this book was published in 1967. And the premise of it is that it deals with the concept of the apocalypse in fiction, which is why I thought it would pair well with the William Maxwell book, because even though it's not set in like a dystopian future or anything like that, it does deal with a sort of catastrophic or apocalyptic event in the form of the influenza epidemic. So I thought they would pair well together. So I will say a little bit more about this before I tell you about the Frank Kermode. So I liked this book overall. I actually kind of felt like it could have been longer. I kind of would have liked for it to have been longer, so we could have delved a little bit more deeply into some of the characters, especially maybe the father. I kind of feel like his section is the shortest. But I did like it overall. I felt like the structure made sense. I felt like most of the characters were pretty well rounded, with the exception of the mother, who I felt like was just sort of put on a pedestal as a saint by all of the men who are narrating, or they're not narrating, but it follows their perspective. So they're all sort of thinking of her as this saint in their mind. So I felt like she really was not a fully well-rounded, fleshed out, 3-dimensional character. But aside from that, I did like this overall. It was not that difficult to read, and yeah, and I thought it made sense. So I ended up giving this 3.5 stars. The Kermode book that deals with the apocalypse, so thinking about that in conjunction with the Maxwell book, I don't know that it was the best pairing, although I think Kermode makes an interesting point in one of his lectures about our idea of the apocalypse, which is that we kind of need apocalypse in order to justify our own sense of order in the world. And I thought that was interesting, you know, like that we need moments of sadness, for example, in order to sort of truly appreciate what happiness or joy is, right? Like it's sort of in that same vein of thinking that we need to be able to imagine the apocalypse in order to make sense of what our own ideas of order and justice are in an otherwise kind of chaotic world, and what is more ultimately chaotic than the apocalypse, right? So I guess if I'm thinking about it in conjunction with the Maxwell book, probably the men of that book, or boys, right? So that the 2 sons and the father are thinking about order in terms of the mother. I think her name is Elizabeth. Yeah, anyway. I think her name is Elizabeth. But yeah, they're pretty much thinking about order in their lives in terms of Elizabeth, and she is kind of their anchor, and she's the one that everything in the house revolves around. So yeah, actually, now that I'm talking about it, they actually do connect a little bit better than I may have originally been thinking, but, you know, still maybe not the best pairing. I could have paired this with like a dystopian novel or something like that. This book, I ended up giving 2 stars. I don't love literary theory, generally speaking. The only actual theory that makes sense to me is some critical race theory and pragmatism, which is why that is my usual theoretical lens for things. But I do like to occasionally dabble in other literary theory, you know, because I think it's good once in a while to check back in with yourself and, you know, make sure that you haven't changed your mind about something, right? So like every once in a while I read a little bit of literary theory and I'm like, oh yeah, right, I still don't like that. But that was the case with this. I did think 2 of the lectures were interesting, but really only 2 of them had to do with the apocalypse specifically speaking, and the other 4 lectures that are in here were adjacent to that because they talked about things like space and time, but I just felt like the connection should have been made much clearer. I feel like Kermode does this thing that I hate in most literary theory, which is that he on purpose uses obtuse language and throws out all these references like we the readers, or in his case the listeners at Bryn Mawr when he originally gave these lectures, are supposed to have read every single book that he's talking about and know exactly what he means when he refers to, you know, all these different texts. And I don't like that about literary theory. I feel like it's extremely elitist. And yeah, I also just don't like that it's not clear, concise communication, and that it's purposefully obtuse and uses big words in order to say, oh, look how smart I am. And I hate that. I hate that about academia, even though I'm in academia. So yeah, I gave this 2 stars because, again, he does make some interesting points about the apocalypse, but I did only feel like he specifically spoke to that in 2 out of the 6 lectures, and that I would have liked for the other ones to be more clearly connected to his overall concept of the apocalypse. And yeah, I just would have liked for this to have been clearer and more direct and, you know, less, oh, look at how many references and big words I can throw out. So yeah, 2 stars. Alright, so now that Common Core is out of the way, I will tell you about the math-related and social studies-related book that I read for this week. So the math-related book I do not have with me. I read it as an ebook. That was Katherine Heiny's book, Standard Deviation. This is a book that follows a family. So you have Graham, whose perspective the book follows, excuse me, throughout. He is in his mid-50s, and he is married to his second wife, Audra, who is, I think, in her early 40s. They've been married for about 12 years. They have an 11-year-old son, Matthew, together, who has Asperger's. So he is not great at social cues or social skills, and he gets hyper-focused on things that are of interest to him. And in the course of this book, excuse me, he is super interested in origami and ends up getting himself into this origami club with grown men who just, you know, spend their Saturdays or Sundays or whatever day it is the club meets building these elaborate origami things with all these complex folds, you know, things like a phoenix or some kind of dragon, or they all have specific names. But anyway, so Audra is in some way, as I said, she's Graham's second wife, and so she's contrasted at various points in the book with his first wife, Elspeth, who you do meet in the course of the book. And they're, like I said, they're very different from one another, and Audra's in fact very different from Graham because she's super outgoing and social and just like exuberant all of the time and just hyper focuses on little trivial details. In fact, at one point she and Graham are on a double date with this other couple, and she asks a question like, if you went to a hooker, what would you ask for? Just like things that are totally inappropriate, but, you know, funny if you're reading them. and you're not actually involved in that conversation. So yeah, so she does stuff like that, and Graham is just sort of more, he's more introverted, he's more reserved. He, you know, does not want to know the answers to all of these super specific questions. So yeah, it just kind of follows them, and I felt like the chapters in this were very episodic. There wasn't necessarily one storyline that tied the whole book together. It was more like, you know, in chapter 1 this thing happens, and in chapter 2 this other thing happens. Like, I could almost imagine this being a television series, right? And these chapters being different episodes in the series. And so for that reason, it didn't work quite as well as I would have liked as a novel. It felt almost more like a series of interconnected short stories in a way. But it was comical at various points, which I appreciated. But yeah, and I also felt like even though Graham had a few kind of life lessons that he took at various points of the book, that by the end of the book he had not really grown or changed in any way. Which again, I've already said I don't like that. So, you know, like, you gotta give me legit plot and or character development and or nice language, right? So it's gotta have at least one of those, and preferably two. So the book did not completely succeed for me in that respect, so I ended up giving it 3 stars. I did feel like the characters were well rendered in terms of Audra and Graham and Matthew, and I did feel like it was funny, and it was, you know, just easy sort of light reading, and it goes under math because the title is Standard Deviation, which is a statistical function, so boom, math. Alright, and then the last book that I finished this week was Amnesty by Aravind Adiga, and if this is shiny, I apologize. This is a library copy of this book. This was not originally on my July TBR, but this book is on my Goodreads TBR. It just got released sometime earlier this year, and I have followed Aravind Adiga's work ever since The White Tiger came out, which I read and loved. So many years back at this point, and so I've pretty much followed his work ever since. This is his 5th book, I believe, and I've read 4 out of 5 of his books. So when I saw this was available at my local library, I thought I should get this and read it, because when else might I have the chance to do that? So, and this also, I think, fits well for the social studies prompt for the summer school readathon anyway, because it follows the story of a man who, his real name is Dhananjaya Rajaratnam. I probably mispronounced that terribly, I'm so sorry. But he is a Sri Lankan immigrant to Australia. He is an undocumented immigrant, and he goes by the name of Danny. So he has been in Australia for 4 years when the book begins, and this book follows one day in his life. He works as a cleaner, so he goes around cleaning other people's houses and apartments and things like that, and he actually lives in the storeroom of a grocery store where he also works in exchange for being able to stay there, and also in exchange for the guy who runs the grocery store not turning him into the police so he can be deported. So at the beginning of the book, he finds out that one of his former clients, whose home he had previously cleaned, has been murdered. And he thinks he knows who might have done it and why. It is this client's former lover, a man she was having an affair with. And so throughout the book, he kind of grapples with the idea of whether he should tell the police what he knows, especially given his status as an illegal immigrant who does not have any rights in Australia. He's concerned that if he goes to the police, he will just be deported. And so he grapples with that. At some point, actually for quite a long section of the book, there's kind of this cat and mouse game that's played between him and the man who he thinks is the murderer of this woman. And you know, it sort of takes on, it was sort of slow at the beginning, but it kind of takes on eventually more of like the pace of a thriller, because it's kind of like, oh my gosh, are they going to actually meet? When they meet, what's going to happen? You know, is Danny going to actually tell the police what he knows or not? You know, so it was a little bit challenging to read structurally, because it's told from a kind of stream of consciousness fashion where you're kind of in Danny's brain, and so there are things that are presented with little to no context because you're actually following his immediate thoughts almost the whole way through. And so, you know, sometimes he'll just randomly think of a memory, or he'll randomly have a daydream and you're not sure, wait, did that actually happen, or did he just imagine that? Or he'll just, you know, imagine that he's giving a talk in front of a big audience of people, like his favorite author, Kiran Rao, whose quotes also come to him sporadically throughout the book. So it was a little challenging and kind of slow to get into for that reason, because I kind of had to get accustomed to that narrative style. I don't see that too often in fiction. But I did like the story overall. I found it very compelling, and the further I read, the more sort of drawn into the story I was, and I really wanted to find out what was going to happen to Danny and what was going to happen when he met this man who he suspected had murdered his former client, and whether he was going to ultimately tell the police what he knew or not. So I ended up giving this 3.75 stars. It also has a lot of really good lines in the book. So for example, one of them that I made note of was, "A man must keep reading if he must keep thinking." So I really liked that. And then there's one that's kind of late on in the book, if I can find it. Okay, I can't find it, but it says something like, "Hope is a kind of rigor, despair is sugar." And it's the kind of line that if you just read it very quickly, you're kind of like, that doesn't really make any sense. But when I stopped to think about it, I was like, this is actually brilliant. Because to say that hope is a kind of rigor while despair is sugar, to me is basically saying that in order to keep hope alive, it's kind of a constant practice that requires, you know, willpower and you know, devotion to keeping that hope alive, whereas despair is more like sugar in the sense that you kind of easily crave it, and the more you let yourself get sucked in by it, the more of it you want and crave. So I felt like that was a line that was kind of brilliant in a way. So yeah, it had lines like that throughout the book, which I just thought were very nice. So yeah, so I ended up giving this 3.75 stars. Okay, so those were all the books I finished this week. So now on to what I am currently reading. I am still doing my buddy read of The Red Tent by Anita Diamant with Lindsay. This is my other book that I'm reading for the social studies prompt for the summer school readathon. I think we are 80% of the way through this, so I imagine we will finish it up within the next week, and I'll be able to give you my final wrap-up and thoughts about this in my next Friday Reads video. I'm also still doing my buddy read with my friend Taylor of Henry James's Portrait of a Lady. I am about 430 pages into this, and that is a little over 2/3 of the way through, so I'm still reading and wondering what is going to happen to Isabel Archer, so we shall see. And then I also this week started my other book for the math prompt, which is Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49. I was originally going to just pick one or the other between Standard Deviation and this one, but this is so short, it's only about 150 pages, that I just thought, you know what, I'm just going to read it, especially because it was given to me as a gift in graduate school by my friend Michael years ago, and I still have not read it, so now I'm actually reading it. So I am 60 or so pages into this, so I'm about 40% of the way through, because again, it's short. But it follows Oedipa Maas. So this also, I should say, this was published in 1965. So this follows Oedipa Maas, who is in her late 20s, I think, it seems. And she receives a letter at the beginning of the book telling her that she has been made the executor of a man named Pierce Inverarity or something like that. And she's sort of baffled as to why she was made the executor of his estate. They had been lovers at one point, it seems like, but I think she had not actually seen or spoken to him in quite some time. So she meets the other lawyer from the firm that represented Inverarity's estate, and they're on a trip together, and she sees this random message and symbol in a bathroom that looks like a trumpet. And then some other things happen, and Oedipa just keeps thinking all of these things are connected together somehow. But I'm thinking personally as the reader that they are in fact not connected, and that this is not going to go anywhere, because there have been several clues so far to lead me to that conclusion, including this quotation on page 21. This is said by Metzger, the lawyer, "But our beauty lies in this extended capacity for convolution." So I'm thinking, to me, that indicates that Pynchon is just putting all of these things there, but that they're not ultimately going to lead anywhere. It's just this whole convoluted scheme that's not going to work out. The other reason why I think that is because there is a long section in chapter 3 where Oedipa and Metzger go to see this play, and there's just a super long description of everything that happens in the play. It goes on for probably about 10 pages. And then she goes backstage at the end to talk to, I don't know, the director or something. And then this happened. "You came to talk about the play," he said. "Let me discourage you. It was written to entertain people, like horror movies. It isn't literature. It doesn't mean anything." And then a couple more pages on, he says, "You can put together clues, develop a thesis or several about why characters reacted to the Trastero possibility the way they did, why the assassins came on, why the black costumes. You could waste your life that way and never touch the truth." So I have a sneaking suspicion that that is an accurate representation of how Pynchon feels about what is going on here, that Oedipa is just chasing all of these clues to no ultimate end, and that she's trying to see connections where there are actually none. So that is my feeling about that so far. We shall see if it bears out or not. And then I also just started last night Bettina Love's book, "We Want to Do More Than Survive, Abolitionist Teaching in the Pursuit of Educational Freedom." This is nonfiction. This is the book that I chose for the research prompt in the summer school readathon. And just as it implies in the title, this is about abolitionist teaching. So the first chapter of this book talked about why, like what it means to matter. In terms of children and people of color, and why that should be a goal that we strive for in education. This seems to me that it's geared more toward K through 12 teachers, but I'm hoping that I can still take something of use away from it, even as a teacher at the college level. So I'm looking forward to seeing what else I have to glean from this book by the time I finish. So